When police entered that house in August 2023, they found a 12-year-old boy, duct tape around his ankles and wrists, emaciated to the point where his bones pressed against his skin like a skeleton wrapped in paper. He had climbed out of a window and run to a neighbor's house begging for food and water. The officers who responded would later say they had never seen anything like it in their entire careers. This was not a stranger's crime. This was a mother. Before we begin, make sure you subscribe so you never miss stories like this. Ruby Franke was not supposed to be a monster. She was supposed to be a guide, a beacon of parenting wisdom for millions of families struggling to raise their children in the modern world. Her YouTube channel, 8 Passengers, had accumulated over 2 million subscribers who tuned in religiously to watch her document life with her husband Kevin and their 6 children. The videos showed what appeared to be a large, happy Mormon family navigating the challenges of daily life with structure, discipline, and faith. Ruby presented herself as an authority on parenting, someone who had figured out the formula for raising obedient, respectful, successful children. But beneath the carefully curated videos and the smiling family portraits, something had been growing. Something dark and twisted that would eventually consume not just Ruby Franke but her own children. The story of Ruby Franke is not simply about abuse. It is about the psychology of control, the dangerous intersection of religious extremism and parental authority, and how a person can convince themselves that torture is love. It is about how someone can stand in front of a camera, present themselves as a moral authority, and simultaneously be inflicting unimaginable suffering on the people most vulnerable to them. To understand what happened in that house in Utah, we need to understand who Ruby Franke was before the world knew her name for all the wrong reasons. Ruby was born into the Mormon faith, raised in a culture that emphasized family structure, obedience to authority, and strict moral codes. She married Kevin Franke young, and together they began building what would become a large family. 6 children: Shari, Chad, Abby, Julie, Russell, and Eve. By all external appearances, they were living the ideal Mormon family life. In 2015, Ruby started the 8 Passengers YouTube channel. The name referred to the 8 members of their family, and the content was simple: daily vlogs showing their family life. Homeschooling lessons, family dinners, holiday celebrations, discipline moments. The channel grew rapidly because Ruby presented something that many parents craved: certainty. She was confident, unwavering in her beliefs about how children should be raised. She did not apologize for her strict parenting style. She owned it. But even in those early videos there were signs. Small moments that made some viewers uncomfortable, though they were often dismissed or defended by Ruby's loyal followers. There was the time Ruby filmed herself telling her 6-year-old daughter Eve that she would not be bringing her lunch to school after Eve had forgotten it. Ruby explained to the camera that this was a teaching moment, that Eve needed to learn responsibility and face the natural consequences of her actions. Eve, Ruby said, would simply have to go hungry that day. Some viewers praised this as tough love. Others felt a creeping unease watching a mother calmly explain why her small child would not eat lunch. There was the video where Ruby took away her teenage son Chad's bedroom for 7 months, making him sleep on a beanbag in the living room as punishment for pranking his younger brother. 7 months without privacy, without a door, without the basic dignity of personal space. Ruby presented this as reasonable discipline. Many viewers began to question whether this crossed a line. There was the incident where Ruby and Kevin left their 2 youngest children home alone and went on a trip. And when their son Russell called them because he was scared, they refused to come home early. Ruby later explained that this was teaching him independence and self-reliance. Would you have defended these actions as strict but fair parenting, or would you have seen them as warning signs of something darker? The comment sections of Ruby's videos became battlegrounds. Supporters insisted she was simply a strong parent who refused to coddle her children in an age of permissiveness. Critics argued she was emotionally abusive, that her punishments were disproportionate and psychologically damaging. Ruby seemed to feed off the controversy. She doubled down on her methods, becoming more vocal about her parenting philosophy, more insistent that she was right and her critics were wrong. But then something changed. Something that would accelerate Ruby's descent from controversial parenting influencer to convicted child abuser. In 2020, Ruby met Jodi Hildebrandt. Jodi Hildebrandt was a life coach and therapist who ran a counseling service called Connections. She specialized in what she called distorted relationship patterns and claimed to help people identify and correct unhealthy behaviors. Jodi presented herself as deeply religious, grounded in Mormon principles, and committed to helping families heal. But Jodi Hildebrandt had her own troubling history. Her counseling license had been suspended in 2012 after allegations that she had an inappropriate relationship with a client. The details were disturbing. She had allegedly convinced a vulnerable client to become emotionally and financially dependent on her, isolating the client from family and friends. The suspension was eventually lifted, but the incident revealed something about Jodi's methods and personality. She was someone who sought control, who believed she had special insight into human behavior, and who was willing to cross ethical boundaries to maintain her influence over others. When Ruby Franke and Jodi Hildebrandt met, it was like two dangerous chemicals combining to create something explosive. Jodi introduced Ruby to her philosophy of extreme personal accountability. According to Jodi's teachings, children who misbehaved were not simply being kids or testing boundaries. They were being possessed by demons, controlled by evil forces, exhibiting signs of deep moral corruption that needed to be purged through severe discipline and suffering. Comfort was weakness. Mercy was enabling. Love meant being willing to inflict pain to save a child's soul. Do you think Ruby was manipulated by Jodi, or did Jodi simply give Ruby permission to act on impulses she had always had? Ruby became increasingly involved with connections, eventually becoming a co-host on Jodi's YouTube channel. The content shifted dramatically. Gone were the family vlogs and daily life videos. Instead, Ruby and Jodi posted videos about accountability, about the dangers of coddling children, about the need for harsh consequences. Ruby's language changed. She began talking about children in disturbing ways, describing them as manipulative, as liars, as fundamentally selfish beings who needed to be broken down and rebuilt. Ruby's own family began to fracture. Her oldest daughter Shari, who had grown up on camera, became estranged from her mother. Shari would later speak publicly about the abuse she had endured, the emotional manipulation, the excessive punishments. Kevin Franke, Ruby's husband, seemed to fade into the background. Some reports suggest he was complicit, others that he was also under Jodi's influence, still others that he was simply absent and negligent. Whatever the truth, he did not protect his children. By 2022, Ruby had essentially moved into Jodi Hildebrandt's home in Ivins, Utah, bringing some of her younger children with her. The 8th Passengers channel had been deleted. Ruby had cut ties with extended family members who questioned her increasingly extreme beliefs. She had isolated herself and her children in Jodi's house, where the two women created their own reality, their own rules, their own twisted version of righteousness. And in that house, away from cameras and public scrutiny, the abuse escalated to levels that are almost incomprehensible. The details that would later emerge in court documents and police reports paint a picture of systematic torture disguised as religious discipline. Ruby's 12-year-old son Russell and 9-year-old daughter Eve were subjected to months of abuse that included starvation, physical restraint, isolation, and psychological torment. They were told they were evil, that they were possessed, that they deserved to suffer. They were denied food for days at a time, given only plain rice or nothing at all. They were forced to do hours of physical labor in the Utah heat without adequate water. They were bound with rope that cut into their skin, leaving scars and wounds that became infected. Russell was made to stand in the sun for hours, to do wall sits until his legs gave out, to perform endless physical exercises as punishment for perceived disobedience. When he showed signs of exhaustion or pain, he was told he was being weak, that he needed to be stronger, that his suffering was necessary for his salvation. Eve was isolated in a dark room for extended periods, denied human contact, told that she was worthless and unloved. Both children were told that their suffering was their own fault, that if they would just be obedient and righteous, the punishment would stop. This is a classic technique of psychological abuse, making the victim believe they are responsible for their own torture, that they have the power to end it if only they would change their behavior. It creates a devastating cycle where the victim internalizes the abuser's logic and begins to believe they deserve the suffering. The children were also told that their father did not want them, that their siblings had abandoned them, that no one cared whether they lived or died. This isolation was crucial to maintaining control. If the children believed they had no one to turn to, no hope of rescue, they would be less likely to resist or try to escape. But Russell did escape. On August 30th, 2023, Russell managed to climb out of a window while Jodi was not watching. He was emaciated, covered in wounds, with duct tape still wrapped around his ankles and wrists. He ran to a neighbor's house and knocked on the door. When the neighbor answered, Russell asked for food and water. The neighbor, horrified by the child's condition, immediately called 911. The 911 call is chilling to listen to. The neighbor describes a child who looks like he has been tortured, who is clearly terrified, who is begging for help. The dispatcher asks questions, trying to understand the situation, and you can hear the neighbor's voice shaking as they describe what they are seeing. Police arrived within minutes. They found Russell in a condition that shocked even experienced officers. He was severely malnourished, dehydrated, covered in cuts and bruises, with open wounds on his wrists and ankles from being bound. He was taken to the hospital immediately. Officers then went to Jodi Hildebrandt's house. They found Eve in a similar condition, locked in a closet, malnourished and traumatized. Both children were placed in protective custody. Ruby Franke and Jodi Hildebrandt were arrested and charged with 6 counts of aggravated child abuse each. The evidence against them was overwhelming. Medical reports documented the extent of the children's injuries. Journals kept by Ruby and Jodi detailed the abuse, written in language that framed torture as spiritual discipline. In these journals, Ruby described her children as evil, as needing to be cleansed through suffering, as being better off experiencing pain than being coddled. She wrote about denying them food, about binding them, about forcing them to perform physical labor, all with a tone of religious righteousness, as if she were performing a holy duty. Do you think Ruby truly believed she was helping her children? Or was this simply a justification for cruelty she wanted to inflict? The psychological question at the heart of this case is perhaps the most disturbing aspect. How does a mother come to torture her own children? How does someone convince themselves that starvation and physical abuse are acts of love? There are several psychological mechanisms at play in Ruby Franke's case. First, there is the phenomenon of moral licensing. Ruby had spent years presenting herself as a parenting expert, as someone who knew better than others how to raise children. This identity became central to her sense of self. When her methods were criticized, she could not accept that she might be wrong without dismantling her entire self-concept. So instead, she doubled down, becoming more extreme in her beliefs and actions to prove that she was right. Second, there is the influence of Jodi Hildebrandt and the connections philosophy. Jodi provided Ruby with a framework that reframed abuse as righteousness. By introducing religious and spiritual language, by framing the children as possessed or evil, Jodi gave Ruby permission to act on impulses that she might have otherwise suppressed. This is a common pattern in cases of extreme abuse. The abuser finds an ideology or belief system that justifies their actions, allowing them to commit horrific acts without experiencing guilt or cognitive dissonance. Third, there is the process of gradual escalation. Ruby did not wake up one day and decide to torture her children. The abuse escalated slowly over years. Each punishment was slightly more severe than the last. Each boundary that was crossed made it easier to cross the next one. This gradual progression is how many abusers operate. They test limits, normalize increasingly extreme behavior until actions that would have once seemed unthinkable become routine. Fourth, there is the isolation factor. By cutting ties with family members who questioned her, by deleting her public YouTube channel, by moving into Jodi's house, Ruby created an environment where there were no external checks on her behavior. She surrounded herself only with people who reinforced her beliefs. In this echo chamber, her actions seemed not only acceptable but necessary. The psychological impact on Russell and Eve is profound and will likely last their entire lives. They experienced not just physical abuse but a systematic assault on their sense of self, their understanding of love and family, their ability to trust others. They were told by the person who was supposed to protect them that they were evil, that they deserved to suffer, that no one cared about them. These messages, delivered during critical developmental years, create deep psychological wounds that are incredibly difficult to heal. Research on child abuse survivors shows that the psychological effects often include complex PTSD, difficulty forming healthy relationships, struggles with self-worth, and a distorted understanding of normal family dynamics. Children who are abused by their parents often struggle with a painful contradiction. They still love and crave approval from the person who hurt them, even while recognizing intellectually that the abuse was wrong. This creates a cognitive dissonance that can take years of therapy to resolve. In December 2023, Ruby Franke pleaded guilty to 4 counts of aggravated child abuse. Jodi Hildebrandt also pleaded guilty to 4 counts. Both women were sentenced to prison, with Ruby receiving 4 consecutive sentences of 1 to 15 years each. Under Utah law, the sentences will run consecutively but are capped at 30 years total. During her sentencing hearing, Ruby made a statement. She claimed that she had been under the influence of a dark delusion, that Jodi Hildebrandt had manipulated her, that she now recognized her actions were wrong. She apologized to her children and said she hoped they could one day forgive her. But many who followed the case found her statement hollow. Ruby had spent years documenting her parenting philosophy, years defending her methods, years insisting she was right. The abuse did not happen in a moment of weakness or temporary insanity. It was systematic, prolonged, and deliberate. Ruby kept journals detailing what she was doing. She made conscious choices every day to continue the abuse. Was Ruby's statement genuine remorse, or was it a final manipulation, an attempt to present herself as a victim to reduce her sentence? Jodi Hildebrandt showed no remorse. In her statement, she maintained that her methods were correct, that she had been trying to help the children, that the legal system did not understand the spiritual battle she was fighting. This lack of remorse is perhaps even more chilling than Ruby's questionable apology. It suggests that Jodi still believes she was right, that given the opportunity, she would do the same things again. The case of Ruby Franke raises broader questions about parenting influencers, about the dangers of extreme religious beliefs, and about how we as a society identify and intervene in cases of child abuse. Ruby Franke had millions of followers. Thousands of people watched her videos and saw the warning signs, yet the abuse continued for years. Some viewers reported concerns to authorities, but those reports did not result in intervention until Russell escaped. This raises difficult questions about the limitations of child protective services, about the challenges of investigating abuse in families that appear functional on the surface, and about the role of social media platforms in monitoring content that may depict abuse. Should YouTube have acted sooner? Should there be stricter regulations on family vlogging channels? How do we balance parental rights with child protection? The case also highlights the dangers of extreme religious beliefs when they are used to justify abuse. Ruby and Jodi framed their actions in spiritual terms, claiming they were saving the children's souls. This is not unique to their case. Throughout history, religion has been used to justify horrific acts, from the Inquisition to modern-day cults. When someone believes they are acting on divine authority, they can commit acts of cruelty without experiencing normal moral constraints. This does not mean that religion itself is the problem. Millions of religious people raise their children with love and respect. But when religious belief becomes extreme, when it is used to justify harm, when it creates an us versus them mentality that isolates believers from outside perspectives, it can become dangerous. The children of Ruby Franke are now in the care of Child Protective Services. They are receiving medical treatment and therapy. Their older siblings, including Shari, have spoken publicly about their desire to support their younger siblings and help them heal. Kevin Franke has filed for divorce and has stated that he was also manipulated by Jodi Hildebrandt, though many question why he did not do more to protect his children. The road to recovery for Russell and Eve will be long and difficult. They will need years of therapy to process what happened to them, to rebuild their sense of self, to learn what healthy relationships look like. They will need to reconcile the fact that their mother, the person who should have loved and protected them unconditionally, instead chose to torture them. This is a betrayal so profound that it shakes the foundation of a person's ability to trust and connect with others. But there is hope. Children are remarkably resilient, especially when they receive proper support and care. Russell and Eve have each other, they have siblings who love them, and they have access to resources that can help them heal. They escaped. They survived. And while the scars of what they endured will never fully disappear, they have the opportunity to build lives that are defined by more than their trauma. The case of Ruby Franke is a reminder that evil does not always look like what we expect. It does not always come from strangers in dark alleys. Sometimes it comes from people who present themselves as moral authorities, who speak the language of love and discipline, who convince themselves and others that their cruelty is righteousness. Ruby Franke was not a monster in the traditional sense. She was a mother who became so consumed by her need for control, so influenced by dangerous beliefs, so isolated from reality, that she lost sight of the most fundamental truth of parenthood, that children are not possessions to be molded through force, but human beings deserving of love, respect, and protection. When you look at your own life, at the people you trust, at the authorities you follow, do you see the warning signs? Do you question beliefs that justify harm? Do you speak up when something feels wrong, even if the person doing it seems confident and righteous? The children who suffer abuse often cannot save themselves. They depend on adults to see what is happening and intervene. Russell was able to escape, but only after months of torture. How many children are still trapped in situations like his, suffering in silence, waiting for someone to notice, someone to care, someone to save them? Ruby Franke is in prison now, but the questions her case raises remain. How do we protect children from the people who are supposed to protect them? How do we identify abuse when it is hidden behind closed doors and justified with religious language? How do we create a society where children like Russell and Eve do not have to suffer for months before someone helps them? These are not easy questions and they do not have simple answers. But they are questions we must continue to ask, because the alternative is to allow more children to suffer, more families to be destroyed, more people like Ruby Franke to convince themselves that torture is love. The story of Ruby Franke is not just about one woman's descent into abuse. It is about the systems that failed to stop her, the beliefs that enabled her, and the children who paid the price for her delusions. It is a story that should disturb us, that should make us question our assumptions. That should remind us that the most dangerous people are often those who are absolutely certain they are right. And it is a story that should make us ask ourselves, if we saw the warning signs, would we have the courage to act, or would we look away and tell ourselves it was not our place to interfere? Because in the end, the difference between a child who is saved and a child who continues to suffer often comes down to whether one person was willing to make that call, to report that concern, to refuse to look away. Ruby Franke's children are safe now, but their story is not over. They will carry what happened to them for the rest of their lives. And we, as a society, must carry the knowledge that this happened, that it could happen again, and that we have a responsibility to do better,